All right, hello again. I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, way down in the southern portion of the state. And fortunately, today we've not been terribly impacted by Hurricane Sally, so we're able to be here today and to talk about our topic. And our topic for today is the diseases and insect pests of daylily. We'll talk a little bit about daylily plants, but primarily we're going to focus on some diseases that can impact them and how we can manage those. And similarly for, excuse me, insect pests that are problems with this plant. We're fortunate there aren't so many problems, and unfortunately, we can address those relatively easily. So I want to talk just very quickly about daylilies themselves. Some really nice images here. Really, just absolutely gorgeous flower that comes up, and there are many different varieties of daylily. Sometime later in this presentation, I make a reference where I say there's something in this range of 70,000 named varieties of daylily. When I was talking with a daylily group recently, they corrected me. It's over 80,000 now. So there is a magnificent amount of diversity in flower structure and flower height, when they bloom, all of the different colors that are available. So there are daylilies that suit just about anyone who could ever want to have one. They are relatively easy to grow and to take care of. All we need to do is plant them in full sun, about 18 to 24 inches apart. They do like soils with good organic matter, and they do we do need to make sure that we're taking care of their fertilization to ensure that we get the most out of them. Generally, applying not a lot of nitrogen and higher rates when we look at the phosphorus and potash or potassium, however you want to say that. Slow release fertilizers are going to be really good. And generally are going to be applied in the early spring and then again in midsummer. And other than that, really, we just want to make sure that we divide them when the clumps become crowded. As the clumps of the daylilies get crowded, we can see a little bit of a decline in their flowering. So dividing them every few years, and I've seen recommendations from 3 years to 5 years, can really help. And then, of course, you have more daylilies that you can include in your home landscape. And one of my favorite things to do, you can share those with other people who will enjoy them, which I think is an extraordinarily important part of gardening. So relatively easy to maintain, relatively easy to plant in the home landscape, very easy to propagate through division. Though you'll also see daylilies produced from seed or from vegetative propagation from a plantlet along their scape or along the flower spike, but a relatively no-nonsense plant to have there in the home landscape. And as we are going to be talking about plant disease today, I always like to include this on any presentation where I am talking about plant disease, because I think these 5 elements really make up the most important things that we can think about when we think about disease management, not only for daylilies, but really for any crop that we're going to work with. And in no particular order, but I do think sanitation is really one of the most important things we can do. It's not the glamorous job out there in the garden to go out there and remove any diseased plant material, or to go out there and remove plants at the end of the season. But doing that really does a very good job of removing the disease organism from the environment. and preventing the plant from being able to be reinfected. Mulch is another really important element there. Having a mulch serves as a barrier between the plant and the soil, and a lot of the disease organisms reside in the soil. And so having that mulch layer there just gives your plant a barrier so that organism can't get splashed up onto the plant, and you prevent a lot of the infection. Now, it is important to change out those mulches just in order to prevent the mulch from serving as that same reservoir of disease organisms. Ideally, we want to keep our watering even. I highly recommend drip irrigation, and you can go back and see the YouTube presentation that's available on designing irrigation systems. But really keeping that water off of the foliage as much as we possibly can is essential for managing diseases. A lot of the fungal and bacterial diseases require those leaves to be wet for 6 or 9 hours or even longer in order for that little spore from the fungus or bacterium to be able to invade that plant. And so not watering when the plant is going to stay wet for a long period of time is really important. Generally, what we want to do is have the dew dry on the plants and then wait a little bit and then water again, or just water in such a way that the leaves never get wet by using drip irrigation. Resistant varieties are really important, probably the most cost-effective and easy way to manage diseases. I know in there I say vegetable diseases, but it applies just as much to trees or to ornamental plants. That resistance really allows us to prevent disease from the very beginning. One thing that I do always want to make sure that I say about resistance is, it's kind of like a water resistant watch. They're resistant up to a point, but if the disease organism is very common, if the environment is very favorable, resistance can be overcome. And finally, you do want to make sure that you're purchasing disease-free plants. So when you go and purchase a plant at the nursery or get one from a friend or whatever you're doing, it's a really good idea to give them a very thorough look over to ensure that you're not bringing any disease organisms into your landscape. So now I get to the other slide that I include in all of these disease presentations. This is the disease triangle, and what this basically means is, in order for a disease to take place in a plant, you need 3 different things. You need a pathogen or an organism that can cause that disease, and you need a plant that's going to be susceptible to that pathogen. The other thing you really need is an environment that's favorable. Usually that's going to be a factor of how much water is present, or if the temperature is particularly good for the development of that particular pathogen. And so what we want to do in disease management is be able to affect one of the components of the disease triangle, or preferably more than one, in order to prevent disease. So using sanitation and preventing the introduction of diseased plants removes that virulent pathogen from the area of our landscape. Using resistant varieties allows us to make sure we don't have a susceptible host. And then proper watering and proper planting and plant care really makes up the elements sort of, of eliminating that favorable environment. And if we do that, then we have really effective disease management. Of course, fungicides will also be a comment, or other bactericides can also be a component of disease management. We'll speak about that when we talk about the specific diseases. And with that, I want to talk about what's probably the most serious issue we're going to run into as far as diseases of daylily, and that is daylily rust. Daylily rust is caused by a fungus. It's one of the rust fungi. the genus Puccinia, and you can see the scientific name there. Um, you can pronounce that any way you like. A wonderful thing about Latin and Greek is that no one really knows how to pronounce them, so you can't get in trouble if you say it wrong. Um, the symptoms of daylily rust are really obvious as yellow and brown streaks on the leaves. And generally, you will see a lot of small yellow spots. And the images we have here on this slide, the first one up on the top is one of the spores or one of the types of spores. We'll talk about that a little bit. That's part of the life cycle of fungus, and that's really what you're seeing on the leaves. And then you see a really good example of the symptoms that you might see on daylily in that bottom image. So in terms of the symptoms, you can see the very early symptoms there in the picture here on the far left. With those sort of yellowish to whitish spots, those are usually going to be on the upper surface of the leaves. And those show up about 7 to 10 days after the spore lands on the plant and manages to germinate and to infect the plant. As the disease progresses, those little spots are going to erupt into these masses of really bright yellow and orange spores that sort of break open the epidermis or the surface of the plant, and you'll see those yellow and orange spores there. You see that in the top image there on the right, and that's a relatively minor infestation. In some cases, there's quite a lot. You might see hundreds of those lesions on a single leaf, and that can actually lead to the death of the foliage. Occasionally, really dependent on the variety of daylily you have, and of course how favorable the environment is, you may see some of those spots and spores appear on the flower stem, but again, really dependent on the cultivar, and you'll generally see it on the leaves much quicker. The other symptom that you may see on the leaves is the development of these black lesions. What's going on there is that the plant, the fungus, is changing from one type of spore to another. They're called teliospores, and they kind of act as a resting spore for the fungus to go through the winter. For our interest, they're kind of a dead end, but you do see those black lesions. And it's a really good idea to kind of keep your eye out for that, because that's going to be a symptom of the disease that you may notice later in the year. Now, interestingly, daylily rust is one of those plants that, or one of those fungi, I keep saying plant, one of those fungi that has two different hosts. So it goes from daylily to this other plant called Petrinia. And so the symptoms on that, you can see down on the leaves there, sort of a chlorotic or yellow lesions on the leaf surface. And those produce spores that then will release other structures down on the underside of the leaves. And you can see a picture of Petrinia there. Petrinia is not really commonly grown here in the United States. So the picture that I have there in that image is, I believe, taken in Australia, not a common plant here in the United States at all. So the interesting thing about some of these rust pathogens or rust fungi is, of course, they are required to have that living host in order for them to reproduce. And in order for them to complete their entire life cycle, they have to have those two unrelated hosts. In this case, that would be daylily and Petrinia. And over the course of this, they actually go through 5 different life stages or 5 different kinds of spores in order to complete that full life cycle. So you have the spores that you see on the daylily, and then spores that you only see on Petrinia, kind of going back and forth. So the interesting thing here is that we don't have Petrinia here. So really what we're seeing is just one portion of the life cycle of that daylily rust. It's not able to go through its full life cycle, but it is able to repeat on the daylily kind of over and over again. What is sort of important for the development of resistance to daylily rust is that there's a lot of variation in the population of daylily rust. So when we're looking at developing resistance in cultivars, we have to pay attention to all of that diversity that occurs in the pathogen, because we may have resistance to one race of daylily rust, but not resistant to some other race. And so we have to continually work on this process of developing resistance to suit all of that variation that's present there in the population. So even if you have resistance, it's possible that you get the introduction of a different race of daylily rust, and you may see the development of symptoms then. Of course, there are a lot of cultivars that do have resistance to daylily rust, and I would definitely recommend their purchase in order to limit the problems that you have. Now, as I mentioned, Petrinia is not a plant that we see very often here in the United States. And generally, the source of infection that we're going to have for daylilies is going to be from daylilies. So the kind of spore that you see on the daylily is that bright yellow or orange spore that comes off kind of like a dust. Serves as kind of a repeating stage, so that will then infect other daylily plants. Just like I mentioned for other fungi, it requires that moisture for the spores to germinate. But like a lot of the rust, other rusts that I've looked at over the years, it is truly shocking how many spores or how much of that can be produced just by the lesions on a single leaf. A single lesion can produce thousands of spores. There may be hundreds of spores on an individual leaf, and then they may produce those thousands of spores, each day for several weeks. So there is a really dramatic amount of that inoculum or that pathogen, that organism that can be there and can be spread from spore to spore. And when I think of this, I always think of the pictures I've seen of harvesting wheat that had a rust disease, and you see the combine, or you see the image of the combine out there in the field with this huge cloud of rust spores coming off behind it. So certainly a lot of inoculum coming from just that side. So when we look at movement of those spores, primarily they're being moved around by wind. They're very light, very easy for them to get picked up and carried from place to place on the wind. And really low levels of disease, when there's not a lot of it present, it's really easy to not notice it. So we want to, we kind of need to be on the defensive for daylily rust the entire time. And keep in mind also that, in the short area, they can also be dispersed by water. The bottom image there, you can see a water droplet hitting the leaf, and there's little specks that are a little bit harder to see that are actually the spores being knocked off the leaf and into the air just by that water droplet. Really long distance movement for daylily rust is primarily by truck or really by people. So as we move the plants, if they're infested, then it's possible that we can then introduce that either to the landscape where we're taking the daylilies, or we can bring those into our own home landscape. There are, again, there's some effects of climate and some effects of weather. As we get, colder temperatures, again, we're going to see the black lesions form. That's the conversion of those reddish orange lesions that are called Uridinea spores into a different kind of resting spore called a teliospore that are really intended to allow that fungus to survive in the absence of its host. But because we don't have Petrinia, and the next stage, the next spore that would be produced only affects Petrinia, then we don't really have to worry about that. So where we're seeing spread is daylily to daylily. And generally speaking, it doesn't survive well in areas where we get below freezing temperatures. Where we see it is down here in the south, where we don't have a lot of freezing temperatures that would kill that off. We see infestations come in as we bring plants in from warmer areas, or it can be blown in on the wind. This is included just because it's a question I've gotten. In terms of alternate hosts, there was at one point a thought that daylily rust might also affect the hosta, which of course is a very common landscape plant. But fortunately, the organism that causes rust on hostas is a different organism and doesn't cause any disease for daylilies. There are some wild daylily plants in Japan where they see that, but really, this is a problem that really affects this cultivated species, and we don't see it in a lot of other places, at least not here in the United States. In terms of management for daylily rust was introduced to the United States. It's not a problem that we saw prior to about the year 2000. And initially, there was an attempt to quarantine it to prevent it from spreading all over. And unfortunately, that attempt at quarantine was not really effective. So it has since spread around and can be found fairly commonly where in areas where we do have daylilies. So in terms of management, one of the important things we can do, of course, is scouting the plants we have, looking for symptoms and signs of the disease. There are some fungicides that we can use for management of daylilies, and I will get to that here in just a second. But very importantly, disease-resistant cultivars are being developed. Those are being tested. They had a big program to test those at the University of Georgia with the USDA and several other organizations. Here's the slide where I make the claim that there's 71,000 registered daylily cultivars. As I said, that's an old number, and very likely that number is over 80,000 now, because the daylily breeders are certainly prolific. And over on the right side, you'll see some examples of some daylily cultivars that are least susceptible or more resistant, such as Mini Pearl or Mac the Knife or Holy Spirit. That is, of course, out of the 80,000 cultivars, just a very, very tiny selection. So there are just something to investigate. And because there's so many varieties, having to check each variety takes time and effort. So don't be surprised if we don't have the complete information on that as we're looking at some of the newer varieties. But definitely resistance and using resistance is one of the most important things we can do. As I said, make sure we're checking out those new plants before we purchase them. Only introduce disease-free plants into your landscape. With plants like this, I keep a special area in my landscape that's kind of set aside where I bring new plants and watch them for a week or so, just to make sure that I don't start to see any symptoms develop in them before I move them into my landscape. So having a little quarantine area in the landscape is a great thing to do. That way, I've avoided introducing things several times that could have potentially caused problems. One easy way to check for rust is you can just take a white tissue or a white cloth and wipe the leaf, and you'll see that orange color show up on that piece of cloth. Again, using resistant cultivars, using drip irrigation rather than overhead irrigation if you can. In the fall, sanitation by removing any dead leaves from around the base of the plant, getting rid of those clippings, all very effective. And I had a question when I was talking with the Daylily Society about how to get rid of those clippings. They asked me if they could burn it right there in the middle of the garden. And it was raised as a good point. You want to take that a distance away and get rid of it. If you leave it right there in the middle of your garden, or even if you burn it right there in the middle of your garden, you might have the spores move up from that, and we don't want to see that. You can use several fungicides for management of daylily rust. That includes the propiconazole, which is a very effective systemic fungicide. Also, myclobutanil and chlorothalonil, which are really common fungicides that are used in home landscapes, are effective for management of daylily rust. As with a lot of things, fungi or fungicides are more a better preventative tool than they are a curative tool. We don't really cure the plant of the fungus, we just prevent it from spreading further. So generally, they recommend spraying at about a 2-week interval. And of course, they also recommend not to spray chlorothalonil, or the trade name is daconil very commonly, while the plant is blooming. Get on to one of the other diseases of daylily I'd like to mention much more briefly. This is leaf streak. It's caused by a different fungus called Arobasidium microstichum. And you kind of have a very similar symptoms expressed for this. You see those long yellow streaks, particularly along the mid vein of the leaf. Then you get browning. And you usually see this from the tip of the leaf downward. In extreme cases, that leaf may just wither off and die. Of course, the easy way to tell leaf streak from daylily rust, use that cloth method. If you see those really, orange, bright orange spores, then you know you have daylily rust and not leaf streak. Being able to isolate the plant if it is showing symptoms is important. As with other things, avoiding overhead irrigation, purchasing disease-free plants, removing dead foliage. A lot of that is kind of repetitive because it's the important lesson for managing pretty much all diseases. And again, there are resistant varieties that can be planted for leaf streak. And you can use fungicides for its management, including the 2 fungicides that are mentioned here. Are thiophanate methyl, a lot of different trade names, and myclobutanil as well. Both really work to protect that susceptible new growth from infection by the fungus. Nematodes are a common problem on a lot of plants and daylilies as well. Nematodes are a kind of worm that lives down in the soil, and they lead to by feeding on the roots, they lead to the stunting of the plant and generally make it yellow. Often it won't bloom very vigorously, and it tends to affect all of plants within an area, and that area will slowly expand. Most important thing for nematodes is using resistance, and if possible, rotating away to a non-host species. Easiest way to detect a nematode problem is to look at the root system. You can see the daylily roots there on your left, and the sort of nodules that are formed there. That's really characteristic of root knot nematode, which is the most common problem nematode we run into here. One thing that I don't mention on my slides is planting marigolds. French marigolds give off a chemical from their roots that nematodes don't like. It kind of gets them to go away. And so planting marigolds is a good way. If you can't rotate off, you can't use resistant varieties, add in some marigolds, and that can help. To an extent, it's certainly not a silver bullet in terms of trying to control this cause of disease. So So I want to take some time now to talk about some of the insects that impact daylilies. Of course, the big banner here just to give me the transition and show you a close up of some of those insects. The first one I'm going to talk about are flower thrips. There are several species. The eastern flower thrip is really common. There's an eastern, there's a western, there's a flower thrips. So quite a variety there. Um, and as I know I've mentioned before, you can win at Jeopardy someday. Because you know that thrips is the singular form, so that it always has that S on there. And Dr. Jack Reed, who is the thrip specialist at MSU when I first started, won't make you spend a day keying out thrips if you make sure that you say that S. They are very small insects. They're about a 1/16 of an inch long, and that makes them very difficult to detect on the plant. We generally find them on leaves, between flower petals, and they feed by scraping on the leaf, which can cause the flowers to be distorted or to die without opening. And in minor cases will give kind of a silver speckle or streak on the surface of the leaves. And again, you may see the flowers and the leaves die if you have a really severe infestation. The difficulty in detecting some of these insects is because they're so small, they're really easy to overlook. One of the methods that is used to try to detect them is to take an index card or a white sheet of paper and tap the plant, particularly tap the flower over that, and look for those thrips down on that piece of paper because they'll be moving around and a little easier to see. If you do that, get yourself a cheap magnifying glass because they are very small and very hard to detect. Another thing you can do that works a little bit easier and requires a little bit less beating on the plant is to take a yellow sticky card. You see that in the top image there. And you can put that in your garden as a way to kind of check it and see if you start to see, small insects appear that would lead you to think that you might have a thrips problem. Um, just a little bit easier in my mind. Occasionally, you will see those sticky cards advertised as a way to control insects. They really are not effective. You're not going to see control of them by having that sticky card there, but it is an effective way to detect a lot of the problems that we might have in our landscapes. We can spray for them. For thrips, you can use insecticidal soap or spinosad as effective insecticides to manage thrips problems. As with any product, fungicide, insecticide, anything like that, you always want to make sure you follow those label directions so that we apply it properly and get effective control from it. Two-spotted spider mite is a even smaller organism that causes problems on our plants. Not technically an insect. It's a mite, so they're arachnids rather than insects. But they are only about a 50th of an inch long. But they feed fairly similarly. They puncture the plant tissue and suck out plant sap. We tend to see them more when the weather is really hot and really dry. The populations increase more. And when you get a really, really big population of mites on the plant, you will see the formation of webbing. And that is true to being arachnids. They're putting a webbing out. They protect their young that way and protect their eggs that way. So that, certainly seeing that webbing on the plants is a really good indication that you have the problem. And you'll see that very similar to thrips, you're going to see that speckling appearance on the leaves that you see down there in that bottom image. Again, you're going to sample them the same way. You can knock the plant over a white sheet of paper to look for them. Really pay attention to the symptomatology. Pay attention to looking for that speckling on the leaves That's going to be your best sign when to go out there and check and see if this is what's going on. They are extraordinarily small, so there's you really need to have a good eye to see what's going on. And generally, I tend to identify this problem more by by seeing that speckled appearance rather than actually seeing the spider mites. Some things we can do to help manage them, of course, getting rid of any weeds that the mites could live on and spread to. You can use insecticidal soap for their control. And I've seen some recommendations for bifenthrin for mite control, though I think insecticidal soap in most cases is going to be a better option. Aphids, a really common insect that we deal with on a lot of different crops. Tend to see them more in cool weather. And very often what we see is a very large population of aphids really suddenly, particularly on the underside of leaves of the plant. And the plants will have a sticky feel to them from all the sugar that the aphids exude. Call that honeydew because they feed on those sugars in the plant and don't process them all, and they all come out. And occasionally we will see the formation of that black sooty mold. It's a fungus that lives on the surface of the leaf when it has that sugar to feed on. And again, insecticidal soaps are going to be effective for controlling aphid populations. Um, as with all of these insects, one thing that's really important is when we try to control these populations, it's really important we get very thorough coverage of the plant because the populations can increase very quickly. They like to kind of hide a little bit, particularly under leaves. So making sure we get that spray on all of those leaf surfaces is going to be important for managing them. Slugs and snails, really common in gardens and can kind of wind up giving you those ragged notches on the plant as they feed. And of course, you'll see the little slimy trails they leave behind. One thing we can do to prevent problems with that is that during the day they like to hide in areas where the sun doesn't reach. So removing any mulch around the plant and removing hiding places that they might have can be an effective way to prevent the problem. You can also use various baits. There are a number of baits that have iron phosphate as a slug or snail bait. I haven't had a lot of experience using those. Primarily, I have always used a can of beer poured in, small amount poured into the bottom of a container and put level with the level of the soil. And that does a pretty good job of collecting the slugs and snails out of my landscape. So I do think that that's pretty effective, and you don't run into some of the problems you might have with baits. Another really common insect we deal with is the leaf miner. It is a small fly, which you're kind of unlikely to see the fly unless you just happen to get there at the right time. They lay their egg on the surface of the leaf, and like other leaf miners, the daylily leaf miner just burrows into the immature burrows into the leaf, and then leaves those feeding trails down the surface of the leaves. Um, they are, removing any foliage where they've been infested. If there's still a live daylily leaf miner there, can reduce the spread of the pest. Practically speaking, applications of the insecticide spinosad are effective for daylily leaf miner, just as we would see it be effective for leaf miners on tomato or leaf miners on citrus plants. All right, so thank you very much. That's the topic for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be very happy to take your questions. If you're here for the Zoom presentation today, I can take your questions live or over in the chat area. If you're watching on YouTube, I invite you, if you have any questions, you can put those down in the comment section. I do keep an eye out for that, and if you have a question, I'll respond back to you. So thanks, and have a wonderful day. All right. So want to go ahead and first of all, any questions anybody has, be thrilled to answer them. You can put them over in the chat area, or you can unmute yourself, and I would be happy to address